The autumn wind is a pirate, blustering in from sea. With a rollicking song he sweeps along, swaggering boisterously. His face is weather-beaten. He wears a hooded sash, with a silver hat about his head, and a bristling black mustache. He growls as he storms the country, a villain big and bold. And the trees all shake and quiver and quake as he robs them of their gold. The autumn wind is a raider, pillaging just for fun.
I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks.
Great cash, homie.
I don't shine shoes, I don't tape ankles, I don't cut checks.
Great cash, homie. Everybody want clap.
Welcome to the Week 6 edition of the Rearview Mirror podcast. This is the podcast where we take a look back at everything while it's still fresh in our minds in our rearview mirror. From Week 5, we break everything down, all the angles, all the games, figure out why teams won, why they lost, what we can learn from those performances that are going to help us become smarter when we're looking at Week 6 and beyond in trying to handicap and forecast some of these games. I've got to tell you guys, this is going to be a treat, I think, for both you and for me, because I love research. I love breaking down the NFL so much that I've dug very deep this week. I have a lot of information to share with you. This is going to be a longer podcast than you are accustomed to hearing, but I think it's because there's a lot of great analysis and information, and that's going to start right here off the gate. We're going to get into some of these headlines, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on these because we're going to dig pretty deep on a couple of different topics. With that said, let's get right into the headlines. Story number one, play calling in the NFL. This actually translates also to college football, and we'll touch on that briefly, but let's focus on the NFL for right now. Play calling, to me, let's just back things up and take a big, broad brush approach to this. There is an optimal way to build your roster, and there is an optimal way to call plays in the NFL to achieve the highest level of success. The issue is that every team doesn't have the right players that they need to have the optimal roster. Therefore, every team cannot call the optimal plays throughout the game that will gain them the most advantage because they aren't built in the optimal manner. There's deficiencies that are lacking, and every team has a variety of deficiencies. There's only a few teams that are near perfectly built. Every team has some, and most teams have several deficiencies because they are not very good at figuring out the salary cap, and they are not very good at figuring out what players are worth that amount of money. Therefore, they're going to have deficiencies, and then you toss in injuries and coaching situations, and you wind up having some things that you're going to have to work around. To me, though, when you look at play calling for a specific game, you have to focus on what's your game plan going to be. How are you going to attack your opponent? And far too often, I think most teams decide, especially some of the weaker teams, will decide, we're not as good. We're an underdog this week. This other team is much better than us. We are going to execute and do what we do best. We're going to focus on the things that we do the best because we think that's going to give us the best chance at winning this game. We're not going to try to get out of the box. We're not going to try to get too wild. We're going to just do the few things that we do the best and try to do them so good that we'll be able to defeat the opponent. They focus on that rather than looking at their opponent and figuring out what that opponent's weakness is. How is this team typically beaten when they are beaten? And attacking in that manner. Even if you don't have the most ideal players that would be able to execute a game plan to attack that opponent in that manner, the alternative is basically to give up on the game. And let's give a few examples. First of all, if you decide you're going to scale things back because you don't have a great quarterback and you don't have great receivers, so we're just going to focus on running the ball because that's what we think we can do the best, and we'll try to set up some passing. We're definitely a much better run team than a pass team. We're going up against a very good defense, and we just want to focus on the run. What do you think this defense is going to do? They know that you are a run-first team. They're going to shut down your run game. Take away the thing that you do the best. And then what do you have left? You don't have anything because your focus was running. Now you're left with your secondary option, which is trying to pass. You're probably down at that point in the game because your initial plan executed and achieved nothing on the field. That's why they shut you down, because they knew what you were going to do. And you had no element of surprise. You had no way to put that defense into conflict. And you basically handed the game right to that opponent. It makes you very easy to defend when your opponent knows your tendencies and can take that away. I believe it's far better to go into a game like that being multiple, being aggressive, attacking your opponent's weakness. Try to hit that kill shot a few times during the game, rather than just turtling up in your shell of what you're comfortable with doing and just throwing in the towel at the end of the game saying, this is what we do, and we just lost to a better team. And far too often, coaches aren't willing to be aggressive, go outside the box, try to game plan to beat that opponent by the best way to beat that opponent. They think that by executing what they do the best is going to get them the victories. What it's actually going to do, it's much higher risk and higher reward trying to try something that's more tailored to beat that opponent. I realize that. But that's how you're going to actually beat that opponent. If you decide just to turtle up and do what you do best, then the media won't criticize you because this is the way that you're built and you're not putting your quarterback out there and you're not trying to do things that you don't normally do. But guess what? You're going to end up losing those games. You're not going to have a winning record. And ultimately, when you look at the best coaches in the NFL, whether you're talking about Bill Belichick, whether you're talking about Chip Kelly, these are coaches that are game planning to beat their opponent using that opponent's weakness. And on defense, they're going to take away what that opponent does best. and make them do something they're not comfortable doing. So that's my rant in general about play calling, but it comes into play for a couple of these games this weekend where I felt opponents had no clue what they were trying to do to beat the two teams who went to the Super Bowl last year. Let's start with the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks obviously won the Super Bowl, one of the best teams in the NFL. Very difficult to beat, that's why hardly anybody beats them. But there is a way that you can attack them and can have success. And you just have to look at the last couple of times that they've lost games. That San Diego Chargers game. Last year they lost to the Indianapolis Colts. And since 2012, they've lost 10 total games. Now, what these teams do when they beat them is they're forced to go for long touchdown drives. On average, they have to go 75 yards to score touchdowns against the Seattle Seahawks when they're able to pull out wins. That's the furthest they have of any team in the league. So you have to convert 75 yards worth of plays and first downs to score touchdowns. Now, against the Seattle Seahawks, do you really think that you're going to be able to take a 15-play drive, converting 4, 5, 6, 7 third-down conversions, and end up scoring a touchdown after a slow-plodding 75-yard march? There's no way in hell. This defense is too good. You might get 1 first down. You might get 2 first downs. By the time you're trying to get your third and your fourth first down, you're punting the ball or you're kicking a field goal. That's not going to beat the Seattle Seahawks. You have to score touchdowns. You have to do it in chunk plays, and that's what these teams did. On average, the way that they were scoring touchdowns was they were taking 75-yard drives. They were only taking 9 plays to go 75 yards. They were only gaining about 4.5 first downs, and they were scoring touchdowns using chunk plays. When you look at the Seattle Seahawks, at the San Diego Chargers game where the Seattle Seahawks played them earlier this year, you might think, oh, well, look at all those third down conversions San Diego had. Look at the way that they moved the ball on the Chargers, the slow plodding time of possession. What actually won them that game were the touchdown drives that were chunk play drives that were not third down conversions. They were skipping third downs on those drives. That's what got the points up on the scoreboard and made the Seattle Seahawks chase them. At that point in time, they were able to put Seattle in a precarious position they're not used to being in, which is chasing. They were able to force them into punts and bad plays offensively, and that's when San Diego could run the ball, get no yardage, but chew up a lot of time off the clock. You don't win games that way. You win games by scoring more points than the other team. You ice games by running out the clock and maintaining time of possession. So I think far too often teams will look at, oh, well, this is the way we beat Seattle. Look what San Diego did. Let's just keep time of possession and convert third down. That's not going to get you the lead to be able to beat that team. The way you get the lead is chunk plays, as I mentioned. The best way to do that, ironically, is at Richard Sherman's side of the field. We all know he lines up on the offense's right-hand side of the field, his left-hand side. He plays that sideline. He never goes to the other side of the field. And so I want to look at 2 scenarios in games that we've seen this year. First, let's throw up this initial graphic. Now, hopefully you can see it. I don't know if you can or not. But these are, to the top left is the Denver Broncos when they played Seattle, week 3 of this season. Super Bowl rematch a couple weeks ago. That's the graphic in the top left. The graphic in the middle is the loss that Seattle had to the Colts last year, and the graphic on the bottom right is the loss that Seattle had to the Chargers this past year. Now, what I want you to notice in particular about this graphic, these are from Pro Football Focus, and it's passing efficiency numbers, passing yards, number of completions, number of touchdowns that the quarterbacks had to various areas on the field. Now, keep in mind, on the right-hand column there's 3 columns on every single field, left, middle, and right. The right-hand column, that's where Richard Sherman is. So if you look at the top left, you'll see earlier this season, Peyton Manning did not attack Richard Sherman hardly at all. He threw 2 passes that were completed within 9 yards of the line of scrimmage off to the right. These are most likely screen passes off to the right. He only attacked the 10 to 19-yard boundary there, which would be directly towards Richard Sherman, twice, and completed just 1 pass. Every single other pass that he threw was to the middle or to the left, and you can definitely see the passes to the middle. He's probably normally going to try to throw some of those to the right, ended up throwing more of them to the middle of the field to stay away from Richard Sherman. He only completed 3 of 10 passes for 45 yards and was intercepted once, a passer rating of 6.3. So you can see steering clear of Richard Sherman, for him, certainly not the answer. They ended up losing that game. I didn't even include the graphic here of Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers week 1 when they just didn't throw the ball at all to the right-hand side of the field. And you can see that was just cake for that Seattle Seahawks defense. They didn't have to worry about that side of the field, rolled coverages over to the left-hand side, easily were able to defend that one side of the field with extra defenders and ice that game pretty easily. Now, look at the middle graphic when they played the Indianapolis Colts. This was an Indianapolis Colts team, week 5. The offensive coordinator was calling some great plays, and look at what they did to the right side of the field, particularly past 10 yards from the line of scrimmage. Now, they only threw 4 passes in that direction, and they completed half of them. But that's where they got 1 pass for 73 yards and a touchdown. And that's where they were able to get the Seattle Seahawks pass defense a little bit confused. And that's why you could see overall the passer rating on all plays. Overall, Andrew Luck posted a 104 passer rating this game. If you can convert some passes over on that Richard Sherman side of the field and make Seattle think twice and have that safety rotate just a step or 2 closer to your side of the field, to Sherman's side, than he normally would be. Now you're getting them, you're stretching that defense out a little bit. You're giving them extra conflict that they're not used to dealing with typically, and you're putting them in a more precarious situation. Look at the bottom right-hand graphic. This was the graphic a couple weeks ago when Seattle went out to San Diego. Look at what Phillip Rivers was able to do. And we're talking about targeting Richard Sherman. Whether or not he's manned up on the guy or not is beside the point. You're stressing that side of the field, which is a side that team is not used to defending. Look at what they did there. 10 yards or more down the field in this 10 to 19-yard boundary. Off to Richard Sherman's side of the field, Phillip Rivers went 4 for 4 for 42 yards and 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. That was 150 passer rating. The max is like, 158, I believe. So that was ridiculous efficiency. Now, you'll notice that they went to the top right, 20-plus yards, 3 times. They didn't convert anything, but it just made Seattle respect that they were going to go that direction. And you have to throw some passes, even if you're not going to convert them, deep down that Richard Sherman side of the field. Because then look what it did on the other areas of the field. Look how much better the middle of the field passing was for Phillip Rivers. He had 118 passer rating in the middle of the field. The left-hand side of the field was opened up more. He had a perfect passer rating in the deep left-hand side. Look at what Andrew Luck did on the deep left-hand side as well. A perfect passer rating of 158.3. They went 1 for 1, 20-plus yards each, and scored a touchdown on that pass. And that was giving the Seattle Seahawks a very balanced attack on both sides of that field and not ignoring the right-hand side of that field. So this is the way to beat them. Now, fast forward, the reason why we're talking about this all today is the Washington Redskins had to know this. The Washington Redskins, I mean, if I can figure this out, and I'm not paid by a team to analyze games for them, if I can figure this out through a little bit of analysis, you better believe, or hope at least, that the Washington Redskins are studying how the Seattle Seahawks are being beat and applying this a little bit to what they're doing. But guess what? We'll flip here to the next slide, and we'll look at what the Washington Redskins did in their game against the Eagles on Monday night. Take a look at this graphic. Now, the first thing I want to tell you before you even start breaking down these numbers, before I start talking to you about them, is that the Redskins waited until there was 2 minutes and 43 seconds left in the first half. So almost halftime, almost a 2-minute warning. They were down 17-0. They waited until that point in the game to attempt a pass of more than 10 yards down the field. Attempt. Everything was this short dump-off range. If you look at this graphic here, all these passes that they're throwing, these passes that are behind the line of scrimmage, the passes that are within 9 yards of the line of scrimmage, everything was what they were throwing up until 2 minutes and 43 seconds left in the first half. At that point in time, they decided to take the shot down the field to Deshaun Jackson on the Richard Sherman side of the field. One pass, the first pass they threw of more than 10 yards, it was a touchdown. And on that drive, it was chunk plays. I think they had 1 or 2 runs that gained 7 or 8 yards because they also opened it up with a big pass to start the drive, and then they threw this bomb on the 4th play of that drive. It went 80 yards in just 4 plays. They scored this touchdown. Didn't get to third down at all on those 4 plays. That is the way that you beat the Seattle Seahawks. If you got a guy who's as fast as Deshaun Jackson, how often do you think that Richard Sherman goes up against that type of speed on his side of the field? And you could see when you're watching that game, they tried to roll the safety over Cam Chancellor to match up on Richard Sherman. To match up on Deshaun Jackson. And Jackson just burned him. It was a terrible decision for them to try to do that, and Jackson just burned him. Richard Sherman tried to rotate over to catch him at the end. It didn't matter. It was way too late. Now, that is exactly what you've got to do against the Seattle Seahawks. Look at what the Washington Redskins decided to do when they threw to Deshaun Jackson on passes of less than 15 yards. They threw to him 7 times on passes of less than 15 yards. Little crossing things and whatnot. You're going to get this guy in the hospital against the Seattle Seahawks defense. They only went 2 of 7 on those passes. When they threw deep, they went 3 passes to Deshaun Jackson that were over 15 yards. All 3 of them were completed. He had 5 catches total for 157 yards and 1 touchdown. And most of these were these big chunk plays down the field. So now we look at this graphic right here and look at what they were able to do when they attacked that right-hand deep side of the field. They attacked it 3 times, 2 completions, 82 yards, and a touchdown, gave the quarterback a passer rating of basically 150. They went down to the left once, and they caught the ball for 57 yards. No touchdowns, but that's still a great 120 almost passer rating. The point is, they ultimately figured out what to do, but why in the world don't you approach the game and start the game by doing that? Instead, the Redskins tried running the ball left and right, achieving no yardage, getting nothing accomplished except for punting the ball. If you look at what they did on their 2 scoring drives, they had 2 touchdown drives, 15 plays in total on these 2 drives. 12 of the plays were passes, 3 of the plays were rushes. The 12 passing plays gained 140 yards. The 3 rushing plays, because they were passing and opening things up, gained 20 rushing yards. They had 7 first downs that went to third down just once in those 2 touchdown drives. That is the recipe to drive the ball for touchdowns against Seattle and beat them. The entire rest of the game, the Redskins had 41 plays. They passed it 24 of the times and ran it 17 of the times. They had 140 passing yards. Mind you, that's the exact same as they had on just 12 passes when they were throwing the ball down the field in the 2 touchdown drives. They both, the 2 touchdown drives and all the other drives in the game for the Redskins both had the same number of passing yards. When you look at the rushing yards, they ran it 17 times the rest of the game that they didn't score touchdowns for only 12 yards. What are they? I know you got to maintain some balance, but you start your balance later. You try to attack the defense weakness first. I can understand setting it up with a player 2, fine, whatever you want to do. But they spent way too long trying to run the ball against this defense and achieving nothing. On the whole rest of the game, they had 7 first downs on all their other drives. That's the same number they had on these 2 touchdown drives, 7. They went to third down 11 times the rest of the game. They only went to third down once on their 2 touchdown drives. Of their 14 total first downs, 12 were passing. 1 was rushing and 1 was via penalty. The point here is the way you beat the Seattle Seahawks. Yes, the Redskins are a running team. At least they were under the Shanahans. They sort of are, again, with Jay Gruden, with a younger quarterback in there, less experienced quarterback. But Gruden likes to throw the ball, too. And this is how you beat the Seattle Seahawks. This is what you must do. And they decided not to do that. And they waited until they were down 17 points. And obviously they came back. They almost had to cover in the game. They didn't execute it. Now, people were contacting me on Twitter because I was tweeting about the game, and I posted my full analysis on my blog, which you can go and check out. It's right below this video. And ask me, well, what, are you on the Redskins? Well, no, I actually was not. I was on the Seahawks in the second leg of a teaser, so I just needed Seattle to win the game. But I care more about analyzing football and watching good football being executed and smart football being executed. And what the Redskins were doing was none of the above. So that was extremely frustrating to me. And very disappointing. And then let's skip to what the Denver Broncos were doing. Denver played the Arizona Cardinals. And on this game, and this is actually what the team I teased Seattle with was Denver. On this game, I mentioned how there is a recipe to beat the Denver Broncos. The recipe to beat the Denver Broncos, we've already seen it laid out against Peyton Manning. The teams who know how to do it are in his own division. San Diego Chargers, Kansas City Chiefs. The way that you beat Peyton Manning is very different than the way that you beat the Seattle Seahawks. The way you beat Peyton Manning is by keeping him off the field, by converting third down, by controlling time of possession, by limiting the number of drives that Peyton Manning gets, and by executing plays. And that's what beats Peyton Manning. And against that Denver Broncos defense, they are improved a little bit this year. But we already saw Kansas City with their limited offense. They don't go deep at all. They are very close to the line of scrimmage the way they play. They almost tied the game up there at the end. They were big underdogs earlier this season and almost won in Denver. And San Diego already won in Denver last year using the same exact strategy, time of possession, third down conversions against that defense, which is easier to convert on third down than the Seattle Seahawks. That's what you have to do. Instead, Bruce Arians comes in there, and I really love Bruce Arians as a coordinator, as a coach. He's had success everywhere he's gone. Steelers should never got rid of him, in my opinion. He was great when he went to Indy. He was great in Arizona as well. Led the team to 10 wins last year and didn't even make the playoffs. Started off 3-0 this year. Look at the talent that they have. Look at the quarterback that he's playing with right now, Drew Stanton. He's done some great things there with that team, so I'm a big fan of his. But he decided to just call the game the way he likes to call the game. He did not decide to adjust his strategy to what is the best way to beat Peyton Manning's Denver Broncos. The way that Bruce Arians likes to call games is he's using Drew Stanton the same way he used Carson Palmer. Very aggressive down the field, open passing game, big plays. There's two things that happen, though. And I mentioned this well before this game. I mentioned it prior to week 4 and again before week 5. Drew Stanton has a much lower completion percentage than does Carson Palmer. So what you have is it's not a high-risk, high-reward. He doesn't throw a ton of interceptions. What he does is he throws a ton of incompletions. And what that means is you're having to punt the ball more because you're not converting. So instead of playing much closer to the line of scrimmage and just converting, moving the chains, and marching the ball down the field against the Broncos, you're trying to go for the big shot. And guess what? If you watch that game against the Broncos, hey, that worked for a couple of drives. They got some points on the board quick. Larry Fitzgerald caught a nice touchdown. They were able to get to even a lead and play very well early in that game. But ultimately then, they started to sputter. They didn't have, you're only going to have a couple of drives with the Drew Stanton that are going to be executed to perfection and hit one of those big plays. But when you don't, you're just punting the ball back. And when you can't execute in the red zone, which the Cardinals have problems with, then you're just kicking field goals against Peyton Manning. And punts and field goals are not going to beat Peyton Manning, even less than they would beat the Seattle Seahawks. So Bruce Arians decided not to implement the best game plan to beat the Denver Broncos. He decided to implement his game plan and try to get his team to execute it to their best level. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you're an underdog, and we know that both of these teams were basically 7-point underdogs. The Redskins were home underdogs of 7. Cardinals were road underdogs of just about 7. And when you're an underdog like that, you have to figure out how to beat this team the best way to beat that team. You're not as skilled as them. You're not as talented. You don't have the personnel. What you should have is research and coaching and figure out a way to attack that team in your best interest. And it's not as if Arizona or the Redskins did not have the personnel that they could execute a game plan like that. They just decided not to employ that game plan. The Redskins ended up going to that game plan late in the game when it was already out of hand, and they couldn't come back. The Arizona Cardinals started out with their own game plan, never switched it up because they ended up dropping too far behind. So then at that point, it just became chuck the ball down the field just like they had started out the game with. And ultimately, their quarterback got injured, hanging out in the pocket, of course, letting for these deeper routes to develop. And they had to put Logan Thomas in there, and they didn't get the win, of course. So play calling is huge. And one of the things that I liked the most about the Pittsburgh Steelers when they went into their playoffs or went on their playoff runs in 2005, if anybody remembers that playoff run in 2005, this is a team with Ben Roethlisberger in his second year. His first year, 2004, his rookie year, I think they went like 15-1 during the season. They didn't throw the ball very much. They ultimately lost in the playoffs, of course, but they were a defensive first team with a run-oriented team. But during 2005, this team went into Indianapolis, into Denver, and put up outright upsets in the postseason. The way that they were beating these teams that were better than them, even though they were a defense and run-oriented team with a very young quarterback, they passed the ball early in those games. They passed to open up the run. And if you ever hear Bill Cowher on any of these pregame shows talking, occasionally you'll hear him say how you got to pass to open up the run when you're playing a good team who knows your strength and is going to try to take them away from you. If you go in with the mindset that we're going to try something different, you go in the mindset that we're going to try a different strategy. It might not be in our wheelhouse, but we know how to do it, obviously. Every team knows how to throw passes in this league. We're going to open things up and make it easier for us. Now, I want to take a quick moment. I know this is an NFL podcast, and we spent a lot of time on this, but let me fast forward really quickly to the Nebraska game where they played Michigan State. Obviously, we know Nebraska was a big underdog in this game. There was a lot of money, sharp money, that was played on Nebraska. There was public money and a little bit of sharp money on Michigan State. But this is a classic sharp versus squares game. And we all know the deficit that Nebraska put themselves in early in this game. Okay, they were down 27-3 at the start of the fourth quarter. And I want to take a look here really quickly at their drive chart. I don't have a ton of stats. I know I watched this game, but and it obviously dawned on me, what in the hell is Bo Pelini and this offense doing? But I want you to pay close attention in this chart. This is all the drives that Nebraska had in this game. Of course, look at the way that these drives started and how many, under the yard column, which is the fourth column over, how many of these drives started in Michigan State territory. Yet they scored no points at all on any of these drives. And I want you to look then at the column that's right almost smack dab in the middle of the page that says first play of drive. And look how often, especially to start the game, Nebraska called run plays, 7 drives in a row, and gained, I think, 2 yards almost every single time. Put themselves in behind the chains at second and long, and their passing game was out of sorts. They couldn't pass the ball because they were behind the chains, and Michigan State's defense could tee off. They ran so predictably, ran far too much, and so you can pause this at any time to get a better look at this graphic. But before you do, look at the very bottom of it. And I want you to look and focus on these couple of rows at the very bottom. Their first 12 drives of the game, Nebraska gained a total of 7 first downs. Their last 6 drives, which started where I've highlighted the whole row in yellow, the last 6 drives, they gained 14 first downs. Half the drives, twice the number of first downs. Now, look at the rushing yards and how many times they called run plays earlier in the game versus run plays later in the game. 21 rushes to 18 passes on those first 12 drives. They were running for 1.7 yards per play. And because they were putting themselves in for carries down and distances, their passing game became so predictable because the run game was predictable and they got shut down that they couldn't pass the ball effectively either. They were throwing a lot of incompletions, and we all know, you could see up there, an interception, 3 fumbles. It was a very sloppy performance by the Nebraska offense. Their offensive line wasn't protecting. They weren't run blocking very well. It just looked miserable. Now, jump down to the last 6 drives of the game, the very bottom column of this entire screen. They passed the ball 26 times and only ran it 12 times. Now, I know you can easily sit here and say, well, they were losing, so they had to throw the ball. Obviously, but guess what? Late in this game was close. Late in this game became a football game again, a football game in which Michigan State could not sit back. When Nebraska scored 9 points, they got the ball back with 4 minutes left in the game. They were only down 9-27, and they scored another touchdown. And then that game became extremely close because they scored another touchdown after that, and we're only down 27-22 and got the ball back at the end of that game. Now, I will digress for one moment and say that, again, the coaching staff made some dumb decisions, and I'm not a Nebraska fan or a hater. I don't know anything about the team. So if I'm not intelligently critiquing them like I would be able to intelligently critique an NFL coach because I know all their tendencies, then I apologize in advance. But Nebraska decided when they scored their touchdowns to go for 2 each time. All they needed to do, in reality, is either kick a couple of extra points or convert one of those two-point conversions. They would have had the same number of points. And had they done either or, just kick 2 extra points or get 1 2-point conversion out of the 2, they would have been able to just kick a field goal at the end of the game. And they had the ball down in Michigan State territory. They had driven the ball well on their last drive of the game, well into Michigan State territory, close to being in field goal range when they threw the final fateful interception that ended the game, down by 5 points. Had they just kicked the 2 extra points, they would have been down by 3 and could have kicked that field goal. So this is a bad overall decision, and you look at what they did at the end of that game. They passed for 205 yards, 7.9 yards per play. Their running game opened up a little bit, but mainly they were running just to offset the pass, to open up things for the pass, and then at the end of the game, it was just pass, because they couldn't afford to run. The bottom line here with this analysis is play calling is everything. Just like some of these other coaches went into the game, Nebraska decided to start this game very conservatively without trying to open anything up offensively and put themselves into a huge hole, just like the Washington Redskins did on Monday night. And the result was identical. They were able to come back a little bit, but ultimately not come back far enough. And that's a big problem for this team. I don't know enough about their coaching staff. All I could tell them about this game, they did not call a very good game. And if they had just decided to get more aggressive and throw the ball a little bit more earlier in the game, would have changed this ball game, the outlook of this game for them completely. So with that said, long rant on NFL play calling. Let's move on to story number 2. Story number 2, getting winning information from a unlikely source for sports betting, and that is NFLproject.com. This is a website that I'm involved in a manner of speaking, but it's a site that was designed by a data scientist, built this very complex machine learning algorithm to forecast outcomes of games and predict the outcome of seasons. And I've used it. I'm working with him on the data, work on the website a little bit as well, because it's fascinating. I love this. This guy loves it. He's a full-time guy who does data scientist work in the mortgage industry. I'm a full-time professional engineer. So we're doing this as a side project because we're passionate about it. But one of the interesting takeaways from the site, if you go to the site, you'll see that there are, on the current week page, there's information that obviously shows you current projections for wins and losses in terms of how far a team's going to go, how likely they are to make the playoffs or win their division or win the Super Bowl, and it ranks the different teams in the division. Very cool, awesome graphics, very interactive. You can click on teams and move things around. It's very user-friendly, shows you in a very visual manner. However, the next graphic below that shows you how teams moved up or down in terms of their fate based upon what happened in the prior game. So you can see, for instance, when a team got crushed the week before to a division rival and they were close to being on the brink of the playoffs. That they were a playoff caliber team because maybe the wild card seed, and they lost to a division rival. Their playoff odds might have dropped 20%. And you can see that right there visually. You can see how teams moved up or down. So what I decided to do for purposes of this podcast is share a little bit of how you can use some of this information, not just to learn from, not just to be entertained by it, not just to use it in your research, but also it can be a very good handicapping tool. And what I'm saying is this. Look at that column, look at that graphic, and look at the teams that were helped the most by their result in the prior game, and look at the teams that were hurt the most by the result in the prior game. Now, this doesn't mean that a team lost 50-0, and so it was hurt the most. It means that a key critical loss was suffered. It could have been a 2-point loss to a division opponent. Either way, the team in that locker room is aware that they needed that game and they lost it, and you can see the swing that resulted from that. So let's first look at the teams that were hurt the most after losses. And so what happens is when those teams lost those games, the psychology of them had to know we dropped a big opportunity to really gain some footing. Now we're starting back well behind the pace that we wanted to be at. We've got to get this next game. And I know you could say back up against the wall, you could say whatever you want, and you could say that that's not a good angle to use. I'm not talking about just blindly using angles like that. What I'm talking about is you've got a complex algorithm here that's calculating how badly a team was hurt. And all I'm doing is sharing some results. Starting from week 2, obviously I'm not going to look back at week 1 because that's the start of the season, but even as early as week 2 and into week 3 and into week 4, I looked at the teams who were hurt the most, the top couple of teams in each of those weeks, hurt the most based on the prior week's performance. And guess what is common from these teams? The very next week, those teams that were hurt the most and far away, like more than the rest of the teams on the list. So in total, there was 8 of them from those 3 weeks up through. I looked at week 5's results, but obviously I'm not looking at week 6 because week 6 games has not been played yet. So based on week 2, week 3, week 4, what happened in those games, and then looking ahead to the games the following week through week 5. The teams that were hurt the most, the 8 teams, went 6-2 against the spread in their next game. If these teams were favored, they went 5-0 against the spread. They were also 5-0 at home and 1-2 on the road. They were 1-2 as dogs. So you could see that the teams that lost, that were backed up against the wall, if they were favored the next week, or if they were at home, that is when this team got their stuff organized, figured out what they needed to do, and executed and outperformed their point spread, which is a lot of times set based on power rankings, but also public perception. And that's a great angle to track moving forward. Now, look at the teams that were helped the most. The teams that were helped the most the following week, so the teams that earned a big win, they might be fat and happy. Again, it's not a 20-point win. It's a key win by any number of points based upon what this algorithm is saying in terms of how much it helped that team. That team knows in the locker room how big that game was and how much that win meant to them. Those teams are 3-6 against the spread the following week. That's 33%. They only go 2-4 as favorites. 1-2 as underdogs. They're 2-3 at home, but 1-3 on the road. So when a team, the best angles to attack are a team that was helped the most. If they're then favored the next week, you're fading them. And especially when they go on the road the next week, that's a prime time to fade a team like that. And the teams that were hurt the most, when they come back to playing at home, and especially if they're favored, that's when you're going to ride them. So I encourage you, I'm going to share information on Twitter and that sort of thing about this site, but definitely check this site and factor some of this information in on a weekly basis. This site was not designed for sports bettors. This site was designed as an informational tool because it's a fascinating way to look at the season and see which games are important and see how teams are performing and that sort of thing, just by raw percentages. But I can tell you, with the sports bettor's mentality, there's a lot of ways that you can use this information for gain financially, and I encourage you to do that. Story number 3, let's wrap up the headlines here by looking at scheduling. And I think one of the keys now moving forward is looking at a team's strength of schedule. It's very early in the season right now. You only got 5 games in the book. Some teams have already had a bye. So a lot of teams have not played very many opponents, but it's vital to incorporate strength of schedule into how you're handicapping things. And I'll give you a prime example of why that is so important. When you look at, for instance, take a look at the Washington Redskins. Heading into their game this past Monday, their defense was viewed as one of the top 5 rushing defenses, all these great stats about their defense. They played the second easiest schedule of opposing offenses the entire year. And obviously we know what Marshawn Lynch did running the ball, what Russell Wilson especially did running the ball, and how effective they were when they did decide to pass the ball. So this Redskins team was propped up based on playing weak opponents who were not very good running the ball, and so their rush defense numbers looked much better than what they really in reality were when you look at the strength of schedule. So I know for myself and for my clients, I share strength of schedule information all the time with them on my recommendations that I'm putting out with my write-ups, and it's a big factor. The other thing, too, is you got to look at scheduling spots with regard to teams and how they're starting. If you notice, there were a number of teams, there were 6 of them, that had 3 of their first games that they played were on the road. That's obviously a very difficult situation to go in. Playing your first 4 games and you're on the road for 3 of those 4. Guess what? I'll name a number of these teams. The Patriots, the Packers, and the Saints. Those 3 teams had to do that, where 3 of the first 4 games were on the road. Then you can toss in some bad teams like the Titans, the Jaguars, and the Raiders. Guess what? None of those teams have a winning record or had a winning record through those first 4 games. Not a very good Packers team, not a okay Patriots team, and not a mediocre Saints team. We'll see what the Saints end up becoming this year, but they certainly are not. They're a great offense and a bad defense right now. Averages out to a mediocre overall team. None None of those teams had winning records. 2-2 at the best, 1-3 for the Saints, and the Jaguars and the Raiders obviously were 0-4 each. 3 of those teams got wins in home games this past week. When you look at the Patriots, the Saints, and the Packers, they've been on the road a lot. You come home, week 5, get a win. And so you really need to factor in some of these stretches where teams are playing a lot of games on the road, finally getting back home. How are you thinking? How are you viewing these teams? These teams that had to play on the road a lot. Now they're coming back into a situation where they'll play a bunch of games at home. And you need to factor that into what you're doing in terms of your handicapping, and you also got to factor in strength of schedule. So a number of different things to incorporate into when you're looking at games, but you certainly just can't look at the surface and assume that a team like the Green Bay Packers, who played 3 out of their first 4 games on the road, and just happens to be 2-2 in those games, is a bad team just because they struggled to go 3-1 to start the season with 3 out of the 4 games on the road. So I'm not saying the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl this year. I'm simply saying that you have to factor in where these games are being played and how teams are doing. I mean, obviously, you know that the New Orleans Saints stink on the road and are great at home, although this year they have not been supreme at home. When you look at them barely getting the cover over the Minnesota Vikings as a 10.5-point favorite, winning by 11, and not getting the cover as a 10-point favorite over the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, winning in overtime by 6. This is a team that certainly has some deficiencies, some big deficiencies, but point being, factor in strength of schedule and scheduling situations into what you're doing and how you're viewing these teams so that you can apply it moving forward. With that said, spent a lot of time on this, but hopefully you found it as interesting and exciting as I did when I looked at everything. Let's get into breaking down some of our statistics and looking at early down success rate.